And while you're sharing, I'll just say welcome to the Oklahoma Council for Social Studies online virtual conference this year. You know, our theme is going viral, and there are a couple different ways to view that. So this is our first year of an online conference, so we're excited about it and excited about the opportunities, and we're very, very excited to have Dr. Adam Tyner presenting to us today on the link between social studies and literacy.
Great, thank you, Peter. I don't know, is that coming through? Can you guys see my slides here? Excellent. Well, it's an honor to be with you all. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak about my research today. My name is Adam Tyner. I am Associate Director of Research at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, which is a education nonprofit think tank based in Washington, D.C., focusing on K-12 education and educational excellence, and has been around for a while. I've been with Fordham for 4 years now, I think 3.5 years. And we released this report a few months ago. It's co-authored by myself and by Sarah Koborik, who is a research scientist at NORC at the University of Chicago. And yeah, it's a special honor to be speaking to you all, since you all work in my home state of Oklahoma. It's an honor to be with you guys for that reason. I'm a graduate of Sapulpa High School and the University of Oklahoma. And then I went to graduate school out on the West Coast and haven't lived in Oklahoma for quite a while now, but I do visit as often as I can. I was there just a few weeks ago. And so it's an extra treat for me to be able to speak with your group today. And I'm looking forward to a good discussion. So let me start by, let me see if my keyboard even works here. Let's see. Here we go. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the motivation and theory behind this project. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Eclsk data set that we used. Very briefly, I'm going to talk about the data that we used for the project. Then I'm going to talk about what we found regarding how instructional time is used in elementary school classrooms. Then I'm going to talk about the estimated effects that we found of instructional time on literacy during elementary school. I'm going to talk very briefly about some implications that we draw from that. Then I'm going to talk, since we have a little bit of time and this is a topic that I'm still learning about, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the questions that this has prompted for me. And there may be some people during the question and answer period who may have some responses to some of my questions. And then, of course, we'll have some time for question and answer period for you all. So one of the motivations for this is that we believe that there is a real literacy crisis in the United States. Only, according to the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, oftentimes called the Nation's Report Card, just about a third of students read proficiently in both 4th and 8th grade. And that number is about 1 in 5 for students who come from more economically disadvantaged backgrounds. Now, some people say that the NAEP has kind of a high standard for proficiency. This is just the proficiency standard. This isn't the advanced level that the NAEP records. And although I've seen some numbers that were a little different than this, if you look at different state tests, or if you can find some different numbers, they're all pretty concerning, the ones that I've seen, including adult measures of literacy, where you find that there is a substantial proportion of the adult population that is functionally illiterate. So what do we do about that? Well, teaching reading skills is it certainly feels logical, and in many reading hours and in literacy blocks in America's elementary schools, students spend countless hours practicing so-called reading skills, such as finding the main idea in a passage, summarizing, clarifying, identifying key points, this kind of stuff. But let's step back a moment and kind of consider whether that is really the way to learn to read. So Merriam-Webster defines to read as to learn from what one has seen or found in writing or printing. And to make sense and learn from a printed text, students absolutely do need a specific discrete skill that we call decoding. That's like phonics. Like all modern written languages, except the ones that use Chinese characters, English has sounds that correspond to letters. And students need to learn to rapidly translate from the print to the sounds in order to be good readers. But beyond decoding, what does it take to learn from what one has seen in writing, as the definition says? Well, let's do a little experiment. Here is a random passage from an article entitled "The Molecular Biology of Coronaviruses" by Paul S. Masters. Let's see if we can read it. Now, the coronavirus M protein was the first polytopic viral membrane protein to be described, and the atypical topology of the MHV and IBV M proteins was examined in considerable depth in cell-free translation and cellular expression studies. For both of these M proteins, the entire ectodomain was found to be protease sensitive. However, at the other end of the molecule, no more than 20 to 25 amino acids could be removed from the carboxy terminus by protease treatment. Now, I have a graduate degree, and I can decode this pretty easily. Most of the words are familiar. I think I'm pronouncing most of this correctly. Might be stumbling on a couple words, I'm not sure. But what are the chances that I could summarize this passage to someone else? Could I tell you the main idea? If I were to read this entire journal article, could I identify the key points by any method other than just like looking for bolded text or what's underlined or what's in a bigger font or something? And if I were to practice the reading comprehension skills of finding the main idea and summarizing for the rest of my life, would it help me read this passage? So notice that the term reading kind of conflates two different abilities: decoding, which I can basically do for this passage, and comprehension, which is another thing entirely. On the other hand, if I somehow knew what a polytopic viral membrane protein was, or what ectodomains were, or what it meant for something to be protease sensitive, along with some other concepts and terms, I might have a shot at comprehending and explaining this passage. The problem here isn't my reading ability, at least it's not my decoding ability. The problem is that reading comprehension depends on background knowledge, which I lack. Now consider a fourth grader for whom almost any article in the local newspaper probably reads a lot like this passage reads to me. If we want that child to read the newspaper someday, does that student need more time practicing that finding the main idea stuff? So this leads us to the idea that increasing knowledge is a key to long-term reading progress rather. And a key here is that this is a long-term process, because if we want to boost reading scores in the short term, practicing reading skills may be more effective. It's just hard to cram a bunch of knowledge into the short term. And that's one of the key advantages of our project, which is going to examine student reading outcomes over 6 years from kindergarten to 5th grade. So one of our kind of core theories here is that knowledge is what is the key to long-term reading comprehension and ability. And a hypothesis that we draw from that, or that we derive from that, is that students who spend more instructional time building knowledge will build greater reading skills in the medium to long term. It leads us to our research questions. We operationalize that hypothesis with reference to how instructional time is used. Some types of instructional time may be building knowledge better than others. We originally posited that those might be social studies and science, although you can see we left the research questions a little more open-ended. Our research questions are, first, descriptively, how does classroom time spent on different subjects, including ELA, math, science, social studies, and other subjects, differ across elementary schools? Then the key question of interest here is, do students in classrooms where they spend more time on certain subjects make greater progress in reading during their elementary school years than students who spend less time in these subjects? And then finally, we look at some what researchers call heterogeneous effects, where we try to assess whether the effects of different uses of instructional time, which is the same question as question 2, vary by some student characteristics. They affect students differently depending on their observable characteristics. I'm going to talk just really briefly about the ECLSK data that we use here. The ECLSK is a survey. It's a nationally representative survey of over 18,000 students. It's a federal government survey. It's a federal project. They follow these students from kindergarten through 5th grade. I think they're actually still following them, but the data through 5th grade is what is available now and became available right before we did this analysis. And it includes information from students' teachers on how instructional time is used. So they asked the elementary school teachers, how many days a week did you teach science? And how much time did you spend each time that you taught it on average? And they do that for all these different subjects. And then we are able to compute an average an estimate of instructional time and how each student, how much time they've spent on these different subjects. And then it also has reading assessment data for starting in kindergarten. There's actually 2 measures in kindergarten, and then going all the way through 5th grade. We actually really just focus on kindergarten and 5th grade and use kindergarten as like a baseline. And there's a lot of other information on student, teacher, and school characteristics. We use that as control variables. And for the heterogeneous effects in the 3rd research question I mentioned on the last slide. So after dropping some observations that had missing assessment data or completely implausible values of time use, we end up with an analytic sample of about 7,000 students who have been tracked during this period. So now to the results. Research question 1, as a reminder, was how does classroom time spent on different subjects differ across elementary schools? And this is average minutes of instructional time per day across subjects. You can see that we've got about 2 hours of ELA time on average for these elementary students. We got over an hour for math. We've got around 30 minutes for each science and social studies. Then we have about 23 minutes of arts and music. That includes everything: dance, theater, painting, finger painting, all that stuff is in arts and music. 19 minutes for PE and 3 minutes for foreign language on average, although lots of places have 0 minutes of foreign language. Some places have a lot. So you can see that ELA is by far, the English language arts is by far the predominant subject in elementary school classrooms. If you look at this by percentage, it means about 40% of the instructional time is being used in ELA. And this doesn't necessarily count all of the time that's not used for instruction that still might be in the classroom, because this was the amount of time that teachers reported. So this is the amount of time that they said that they spent on these subjects. And so it was about 40% of the overall amount of instructional time that they reported. If you look across grades, you can see that as we might expect, science and social studies are getting a little more attention in the later grades, and so they're up over 30 minutes in 4th and 5th grade, a little less in the early grades, and English language arts, which is the top line there, it peaks in 1st grade, and then it's going down a bit every grade after that. So it's not quite 2 hours in those last grades. When we look at different types of learning environments by student factors, we see that there's really not huge differences, but there are a couple of things that I would point out. One is just that the highest income students do seem to be spending a little less time on math and ELA than the lowest income students. This is broken out by income quartile. And you can see that, it's 78 minutes on average for the highest income students, or students from the highest income families, probably a better way to put it. They're probably not making that much money themselves. But those students are getting 78 minutes in math per day, whereas their peers who are in the lowest income quartile are getting 84 minutes. It's not a huge difference, but there's a little bit of a difference. And the higher income students are getting a little more time in the non-core subjects. When you look at science and social studies, it really doesn't differ very much by income. So next, I'll turn to the kind of core of the analysis, which is the estimate of the effect of these differences that we observe at the student level and the progress that these students make in reading from kindergarten to 5th grade. So what we find, interestingly, is that the only subject that was statistically significantly correlated with progress in reading over elementary school was social studies. More social studies was correlated with greater progress in reading. And so the outcome here on the y-axis is the standard deviations of the test score. This is really the 5th grade test. And you might think, well, that's just the 5th grade test. But recall that we're actually controlling for their ability in kindergarten. So this is really better thought of as a measure of progress over elementary school, because we're controlling for a very robust set of kindergarten factors. And so you're kind of comparing similar kindergartners and then how they did in 5th grade. And so we see that the students who got an additional 30 minutes of social studies instruction a day did about 15% of a standard deviation better on the 5th grade reading test, controlling for all the student observables, school factors, teacher factors, family factors, and most importantly, all of those factors, student factors from kindergarten. Those include lots of different assessments. So we have a pretty strong picture of what they look like in kindergarten, actually. That's not the case for ELA. For ELA, we see 3% of a standard deviation increase. It's nowhere near statistically significant at any level that would be used by any social researcher. It's essentially kind of a null effect. If you change a couple things in the model, it kind of flips negative, but it's not really very negative. Whereas the finding we have for social studies is quite robust. When we change a couple of things, it doesn't tend to change the estimate very much. And we observe that 15% of a standard deviation difference. Now, when you're contextualizing that to yourself, you might think like, okay, 15% of a standard deviation on a 5th grade score, but that's over 5 years, and not really that big. That's 3% of a standard deviation per day, and per year, and that's true. It isn't that big of a difference, but it's much different than if you were to say just have a 1-year study and there's a 3% of a standard deviation difference. Then you think, well, next year it'll be 0, or maybe there's fade out. This includes any kind of fade out that you have in the middle and any kind of regression or anything like that. So it's a modest effect, but it's a kind of sustained effect. For the other subjects, we're also not finding any statistically significant correlations. So when we look at this research question 3, we look at heterogeneous effects, look at how this affects different types of students. We look at this, I think the most interesting one is probably to look at this by income. This is back to our income quartiles that we were looking at before. And you can see if you look at this far right set of bars that the social studies effect is completely driven by students in the lowest 3 income quartiles. For students in the top income quartile, it actually had no effect. It was completely nowhere near statistically significant for anything. It's slightly negative, but that flips around if you change the model slightly. This effect is being driven by lower income students and middle income students. For ELA, you can see that, again, none of these are statistically significant. In fact, we see almost no statistically significant results for anything except for these 3 strong effects for the students in the lowest 3 lower income quartiles. When you look at girls and boys, the effect for girls is a little stronger. I would say that the difference between them is not statistically significant. So you should take any difference that you're thinking about here with a little grain of salt. But we do observe a little stronger effect for girls. The effect for boys is only statistically significant at the 90% level, which is why you see that little hash kind of crossing 0 there. But the effects are, pretty similar, but a little stronger for girls. we're talking about the effect of social studies on literacy improvement. When we look at the far right set of bars again for English home versus non-English home, the effect seems to be much stronger for students who come from a non-English speaking home. The effect for students from an English speaking home is a little lower than the average, still statistically significant, but not quite as high, and clearly a stronger effect for students who are coming from a non-English home. If you look at ELA, also the students from the non-English home do seem to be getting a little better, a little more value out of additional ELA time, although that result is not statistically significant either. Suggestive, at least. So a couple implications that we draw from this. There's this cliche that students must learn to read before they read to learn. I think that idea is quite limiting of the kinds of ways that you can build knowledge and vocabulary before students can even decode, because there's a lot of students who won't learn to decode until they're well into school, but they can still be having books read to them. They can still be expanding their vocabulary, having good conversations. It's important to not think of literacy as simply just the more you kind of drill these literacy skills, that's the sum content of reading. Learning about the world, broadening your vocabulary is going to be valuable. And we have suggestive evidence here that social studies, additional time for social studies has a positive relationship with the literacy gains that students make. So we think that many classrooms could benefit from allocating more time to content-rich subjects, like social studies, and these are the subjects where students do learn a lot more about the world at large, and they probably gain a lot of knowledge and vocabulary that are the keys to their future literacy. So I've got a couple of kind of next questions that this research has prompted in me, and I'd be interested in your feedback on this during our session. First of all, is elementary social studies actually knowledge rich? We don't have any data on what's going on in these classrooms. So for when we're actually thinking about it from that perspective, this data is it's very broad. We have a nationally representative sample. We have a very large sample size. Those are really positive things about this data, but we don't actually know what's going on in these classrooms. And I don't know. I haven't gone around and observed a bunch of elementary classrooms to find out whether the social studies time is actually knowledge rich. I've heard some people say that sometimes social studies time is when the students get a coloring book that has historical scenes in it or something, and that's considered social studies time. So it's not clear to me whether that's really true, and that's something I'm interested in learning more about. Another question that I've had is, is it as simple as just reallocating some of that gigantic literacy block over into social studies? Would there be some kind of backfiring effect? Is there something that we would not expect, unintended consequences from doing that? We certainly don't find any negative effect of ELA time. It's not like ELA is harming these students, but it doesn't seem to be getting a lot of bang for the minute either. And so shifting sometimes to social studies kind of seems logical based on what we found. And considering that the literacy block is the sprawling thing of like 2 hours, and we hear a lot of anecdotes about the quality of that literacy instruction being low in a lot of cases. So, can we do that? Would there be some kind of, unintended consequences we would live to regret? That's another question I've been having. And then another question is more broadly, what is preventing us from doing better ELA and social studies integration? It's something that people talk about a lot. We talk a little bit in the report about the having content-rich ELA and having ELA instruction that is not just kind of pick random books and then tell us the main idea of them, but actually build step by step so that students are able to encounter new concepts and then really dig into them in a deeper way that is going to build their knowledge and vocabulary more than if they're just kind of all over the place. So content-rich ELA could be good. Is that the route to better ELA social studies integration? Could there be something about ELA assessments, which I'd be happy to talk about later? We have an implication in our report that about how to potentially reform ELA assessments so that they are reflective of the content that students learn and give a greater reason for teachers to focus on that content. So those are some of the questions that I've been having. I do want to say as a final thing, just that we're easy to find. The Fordham Institute has a website. You can easily find me. You can easily find the website. If you want to find the report, it's easy to just Google my name and social studies Fordham, and it'll be the first thing that comes up. Feel free to have a look at the whole report, which is much longer than I can possibly do justice to today, but I've done my best. And with that, yeah, I'm ready to entertain y'all's questions and have a broader conversation about these topics.
Well, thank you for that, Dr. Tyner. So I guess you addressed this to some extent, but I'm just curious, did you see that there was any cross collaboration between ELA and social studies? Like, was there any research at all in your research about that? Was there any data on that at all?
So there isn't anything in the Eclsk data source that we were using. The data that we analyzed doesn't have anything about that. I have done some research in the background of this, and our report has an extensive background section and sidebars and all this kind of stuff to flesh out the kind of theoretical background to all of this. And it's definitely a challenge. I mean, we're talking about elementary school, and so elementary teachers tend to need to be generalists who are covering a lot of different topics. And well, you do have some pull out programs or some teachers who are going in when it's something like math or something that happens sometimes. Normally it's the typical elementary school teacher who is teaching both ELA and social studies, and the extent of the integration is kind of up to them, and the way that their curricula shape that is up to the district, or up to sometimes the state has some hand in that as well. So to the extent that the curricula are not emphasizing content and are not emphasizing really building knowledge, and are more focused on reading skills, these abstract reading comprehension skills that a lot of people think are kind of bogus even in theory, then you're not really getting a focus on any specific content. You're just getting a lot of times people think that this is actually a feature, not a bug, because it allows teachers to sort of pick what will be most applicable to their students. And I get that to some extent, but on the other hand, I think it's quite important that we not have elementary classrooms that are just about only kind of the topics that immediately strike the interest of the second grader or third grader or fourth grader, but that we also structure that for them. Because I think that part of an education is not just kind of following your own interests, but also learning what other people are interested in, and getting some foundation in that, especially if you're going to make a strong transition to middle school and really be ready for some of the more difficult topics that they'll encounter there.
May I ask a question?
Please.
So thanks a lot for sharing your work in this way. I think it's really interesting, and I have had the opportunity to read the report, so I was excited to hear you speak today about this. And I'm kind of curious if you could, and you kind of alluded to it here in this last point. One of the things that strikes me is using this large data set, that the type of social studies, or what social studies looks like in these self-reported timeframes, is of course unclear from the national data set. And so then as you move in your argument towards this identification of knowledge, I'm kind of curious how you define knowledge, and how that definition of knowledge is aligned with or in conversation with notions of inquiry and the push for inquiry as an essential part of social studies instruction.
Yeah, that's great. We have to make a couple of, I think all social research ends up having to have a couple of assumptions and maybe a leap here or two, and hopefully I've exposed those and not hidden them. That there's a couple leaps that we have to make. One is that, and this is why I brought it up at the end, is we're initially interested in the idea that maybe spending more time building knowledge is going to lead to greater literacy. And there's been a lot of work about, the effect of background knowledge on literacy, on observed literacy. That's something that there's a lot of research on. But there hasn't really been a lot of kind of practice level research where we're actually looking at something that is varying across classrooms, even within a district or something, let alone nationally, where you could say this type of use of instructional time might have a different effect than this other use. And so that's the kind of value add that we saw to be able to get this big picture. So of course, there's absolutely some kind of caveats there in terms of I don't know if we're really building a lot of knowledge in elementary social studies or not. If we're not, then probably that assumption isn't valid, and there's probably something else going on that's driving this correlation, like teacher quality or something like that, teaching quality or something. The second part of your question was about the kind of knowledge and inquiry. And feel free to, if when I'm done rambling here, if you want to dig into another aspect of this, feel free. But I think one problem that we see in the education system writ large, but especially in elementary conversations around elementary literacy, is that we have a lot of educators have de-emphasized the importance of really like knowing things. You say like trivia, it's just facts, trivia. It's not really like, it's not important to really know specific things. It's more important to have these kind of like higher order skills, like critical thinking and stuff like that. And maybe inquiry is one of those higher order skills. And I don't think many people disagree that it's more important to have those higher order skills. But what people do disagree about is whether you can get to the higher order skills without having a good foundation of the lower order skills of just like knowing stuff that happened. And so critical thinking, for example, is one buzzword that we hear a lot. There's a lot of people who cast doubt on the idea that you can develop these critically minded thinkers who are going to criticize the structures of society and transform it and understand it, if they don't actually know where their society came from and what the different interest groups in their society are and kinds of know their history and know the problems well. And so I don't know. I think maybe I'd like to know more about how you use the word inquiry, because I think that's the most important stuff as well. But I also think it's important to, and I had a teacher when I was at Oklahoma. I had a professor who actually I was on some thing where I was studying music. I wasn't even a regular student. I was just doing a music program at that time. And it was a music theory class that like all the people take. And he was this professor, he at one time said this thing that I always remember. He said something about how critical thinking was important, but how could you think critically if you don't know anything about it, about that topic? How can you think critically about a topic that you don't know anything about? Something along those lines. And I always kind of stuck with me that it's definitely our goal to train people who, but we're talking about elementary school students, and they should be thinking about new questions, and they should be trying to apply what they learn, no doubt. But they also need to just kind of like learn about, geography and the difference between a continent and a country. And they need to learn some of that stuff that I would categorize more as kind of knowledge. So anyway, I was going to ramble a little bit. That was my attempt to answer your question, but feel free to counter if you think that doesn't cover what you meant by inquiry.
I was thinking about inquiry, and I don't want to dominate the conversation. I was thinking about inquiry in the ways in which National Council for the Social Studies defines it, and how we have, within the field of social studies, been approaching inquiry as the inquiry arc. And I know in some of our local districts that are represented in this group are using guided inquiry practices. So really a systematic approach to student thinking and doing, so that they're able to independently navigate the varied resources that I think you're advocating they be able to do as part of an ELA social studies experience.
Yeah, so I'm aware of that organization and the inquiry arc to some extent. I'm not an expert in that stuff, but I can say that there have been critics of that it's the National Council of Social Studies. Is that right? For kind of leaving out a lot of the content and not making it clear that the students need to know about specific stuff that happened, or specific social relations, or specific types of organizing the economy, or whatever. Like that the content is important too. So I don't discount at all the importance of students learning, and we could talk about more about the specifics of those skills. I'm pretty sure I would agree that they're all very important. I think that a concern is that sometimes the content behind them and the knowledge building, which can be really powerful in elementary school. Students can read and learn a lot of stuff and really be ready for middle school, knowing a lot of stuff. And then we have people who are high school graduates who don't know the difference between a country and a continent. So it's, I think it can be both. Also, no one should worry about dominating the conversation unless my Zoom thing is wrong. We have like 5 people besides me or something. I don't think we're going to have any problem with any of you guys talking too much.
Yes, and many are from my district, which makes me happy. I'm happy to see my people here.
What district are you in, Peter?
Oklahoma City Public Schools.
Okay.
So I had a question, kind of based off my last question, but not quite. Have you looked at Daniel Willingham's research and the research from the Marzano study, which I think was done? I think it's about 10 years old, so it's a while back. But Marzano had a study, and Daniel Willingham has done some work that was similar to yours. And I didn't know if you had seen that, or if I'm trying to think of how to word what I'm trying to say. It's been a long day. But like, how have you been able to compare your data with that information and seen any correlations with across that?
Yeah, so I'm familiar with Dan's work. We cite him. He was actually an advisor on our report, read it over, gave us some feedback and stuff. We absolutely are big fans of his work. He's done a lot, not only in the kind of cognitive science realm to substantiate the importance of building knowledge and having background knowledge and those theories that I was talking about earlier. But he's also done some good work in the, kind of popularizing some of those ideas. He's written some influential New York Times pieces and some other stuff. So absolutely a big fan of his work. Really recommend his work. If you just want to Google one thing, look for his, one of those New York Times pieces that he wrote from a few years ago. If you want to read something short from him that will get to his core arguments. I also really like his book, The Reading Mind. Would definitely recommend that to educators who are particularly interested in literacy. The Marginal study, I'm drawing a blank on for the moment. Can you remind me what that was?
So it was,
maybe I don't know it.
It's the Hirsch Jones article, and like I said, it's probably at least 10 years old at this point. But they did a study on the vocabulary that students need to be successful on standardized tests, and I believe 55 or 65% of those vocabulary words came from social studies.
Oh, that's interesting. Off the top of my head, I don't remember that. that doesn't mean that it's not cited in a report. I just can't remember it at the moment, but that's really interesting. So you said Marginal wrote it, or it was by, when you say Hirsch, you're talking about E.D. Hirsch, Don Hirsch?
I'm actually looking it up right now.
Okay.
So,
well, yeah, send it my way. I want to take another look at that. That sounds like something that I want to read.
Yes, I will find it and post it in the chat.
More broadly, and I think maybe I was looking for a citation on this, so maybe I needed to know about that one. But one of our findings that was probably surprised us a little bit is that we didn't find an effect of science. Initially, I guess I kind of thought like ELA would matter, and social studies and science will probably matter. Probably the other ones less so. And I guess maybe I shouldn't have been so surprised that ELA didn't have a big marginal effect. We're kind of looking at the margins here. These aren't like, so if we already have an average of 2 hours of ELA time, I guess maybe I shouldn't be that surprised that an extra 15 minutes or an extra half an hour is going to not have much of an effect when you already have so much of it, and that you might see a bigger effect for something like social studies. But we didn't find an effect of science. I never really knew. Some of my colleagues really thought that science was going to have an effect, because a lot of people have written about science and social studies being kind of the more content-rich subjects. But when we were trying to make sense out of the fact that we found an effect of social studies but not science, I guess it made sense to me that social studies is probably richer in what literacy experts call tier 2 vocabulary. They have like tier 1 vocabulary is the kind of stuff that like is the highest frequency words like boy and girl and walk and run and stuff like that like pretty much everybody masters first. And then that tier 2 vocabulary, there's a lot of stuff that's kind of like redundant. There are words like annual and words that are a little like more, you need them for sophisticated reading, but you could probably live your whole life without ever saying them if you had some other way to say it. A lot of them were kind of redundant or more sophisticated vocabulary. And the tier 3 words are the more technical words that you only use in one specific circumstance. And, a word like chlorophyll or something is going to be a tier 3 word. We're not using chlorophyll day to day, although I guess it could be a metaphor or something. But in any case, we were thinking that, and my colleague Robert Prondicio also posited this, I think it was his idea first, that maybe science is a little richer in the tier 3 words and social studies a little richer in the tier 2 words. And that on a literacy assessment, for better or worse, is probably not dealing with a lot of tier 3 words, probably dealing most with those tier 1 and tier 2 words. And that could be, building that kind of vocabulary could be part of what had the effect, caused the effect of social studies, but not science.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I put a link in the chat, and then I just pulled from that the quote, 55% of the vocabulary comes from social studies. And that was a study done like by Marzano. This is from 2012. So.
Oh, here we go. Okay.
I was glad to finally find it. I'm like, I know it's there somewhere.
Oh, great. Okay. Let me just click on this before we end our session, and then I'll probably never be able to find the link again. So, okay, good. I got it
now. Dr. Tyner, I had a question. It's kind of going back to what Dr. Brugger had mentioned about the inquiry arc. And like I work in Peters District. I work in Oklahoma City, so I'm not. My question isn't necessarily reflective of our district and how I feel working for my district and for my administration particularly. But you mentioned that there have been critics of the inquiry arc because it doesn't leave enough time to learn enough knowledge, and that leads to some people being uninformed on issues like specific social relations or economic issues. So I'm just curious, like, what would you say, or what advice would you give to teachers that work in school districts or for administrators that might, discourage their staff from discussing, what may be considered to be like a controversial issue for students or for parents?
That's a really difficult question. I personally believe pedagogically that controversy is one of the most powerful things that you can have, because it basically is free intrinsic motivation. People are interested in something. It's controversial because people are interested in it. And a lot of the stuff in school is not interesting. It's not to students. It's not, they don't see any value of it. But if it's something that people argue about, then it could be something that is, is a value. So I guess if I were trying to talk to an educator, a teacher about how to do that. Now in elementary, it might be a little different than in middle and high school, but I would probably say that the important thing, like, you should try to use controversy, but you should also try to be really smart that you don't, that you don't make any of your students feel marginalized because of somebody else's opinion, and certainly not because of your opinion, which they probably should never be able to figure out. So, in classrooms that I've led, and I've never led an elementary school classroom except when I was taught ESL, and I won't really count that. I have always believed that, teaching around controversy is a very powerful motivator, and it gets students talking, it gets them interested, and that the important thing is to model intellectual inquiry as you're teaching that, and to ask questions and to play devil's advocate where you need to balance things out or whatever, and to, most of all, to ensure that no one ever feels marginalized because of someone else's opinion, but also that they don't, that also means that if somebody has an opinion that offend somebody else, that they don't feel marginalized because somebody else kind of like played the offense card or something. So that's tricky for teachers to deal with. And I bet there's a lot of administrators who'd rather just wash their hands with it. But I think that's like the total wrong thing to do. And I think that administrators and teachers should, if you have to have a conversation around it to ensure that teachers know that they shouldn't be, polemical in their classroom, then I guess you got to do that. But I think, a good teacher models that inquiry. They ask investigative questions. They ask another student to give their perspective on something to kind of flesh things out. They can get that conversation to progress in a way that is really valuable for the students. And it's the kind of thing that we all have to do in society. So better to do it early and with some adult supervision than to think you're going to avoid it for 13 years and then set them free on the world. And then God knows how they're going to form their opinions.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking about that, just, especially with things, recently happened at the Capitol, as well as a number of, issues in 2020. My students right now, we're still virtual for a couple more weeks in OKC, but a lot of them, they're asking their teachers questions about these things going on. And I know some teachers that work in my building who are they're not as comfortable speaking about those issues. So I'm trying to think of ways that, maybe Peter, you can offer some insight on this as well, since you work for the district. Trying to think of some ways that we can help more teachers feel comfortable addressing these types of issues with our students. Because, I mean, I work at a high school, so I know like a lot of your research is focused on elementary. But I'm trying to apply it to my work, and how I can help my kids and my colleagues. So I'm trying to think how to best phrase this.
No, I mean, I think it's such a challenge. I mean, you've got, historical events happening around you that are extremely controversial and polarizing for a lot of people. And then you've got a group of students who may reflect some different opinions about it within them, or may just have some different ideas because, you know, they've picked up some different things from different places. And that's got to be difficult. You probably have some that are very, you know, have ideas about what they think. You're talking about high school.
Yeah.
And you probably have some others that don't, but that's got to be very challenging. I'm curious what Peter's advice is as well.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out, you know, how we can get more teachers engaging in these conversations so that, you know, our students have the opportunity to express their ideas and feel like they've been heard. Because I feel like, especially like in this virtual setting, they spend a lot of time getting just like talked at. And,
Yes.
you know, and over the past couple of years, I mean, just in my teaching career, like this is my 5th year teaching. And just so many things have happened in this country over the course of the year. And like, I'm just trying to communicate to my kids, like, that this isn't necessarily like the norm of American government or politics.
It's not.
And I'm worried they're going to become like numb to all this and just like stop caring. So I feel like it's our duty as teachers to like continue these conversations.
Yeah.
And make sure that, you know, they are informed, that they, you know, that they start to develop opinions, and, you know, have a space where they feel comfortable to express or share their ideas. So I was just thinking out loud over here, really.
Well, Tyner, thank you for that. There are a couple of things that I've done. So I sent out on the evening of the 6th, I sent out an email to department chairs and to instructional leadership directors and principals and assistant principals, an email saying, what happened yesterday or today was tough. And as tough as it is for us, whether it's polarizing one way or the other, we've got to have the conversation. You know, this is our time for social studies teachers, because this is clearly showing that what we are doing is needed. And
right.
having these tough conversations in a way where we are moderating between the group and being respectful, like having those norms and laying down, you can disagree, but here's how we disagree. And, you know, you can say what happened today, what happened on the 6th made me angry, and model, look, this is how an adult can be angry about something and not, you know, storm the Capitol. You know, it's upsetting. And here are some things that, you know, that I'm doing about it, or this is how I feel about it, and really model for students what civic responsibility looks like with that. And having students routinely engage in conversation where they can have dissenting opinions, but then they have practice, like one, active listening and not thinking about the response while the person's talking, but they're really thinking about what the person is saying. And what I heard you say was, you know, getting those skills practiced, and also, again, just the you know, living within the norms and respectful responses. And in our district, we are working on something like that as well. You know, we have a vision for social studies, and I don't want to take too much time, but we have our vision for social studies, and a lot of teachers have put it up on the wall and they're like, hey, this is great. But then we really haven't looked at how that impacts instruction. And so one of the things that we're going to be working on, actually starting tomorrow with department chairs, is what does social studies instruction look like within our vision? And a huge piece of that is having these collegial conversations and academic conversations among students, and learning how to agree and disagree, and being respectful in our responses. And so then our next step is going to be, let's identify some strategies that go along with this, and really providing scaffolding for situations like you're talking about. Because if we never have the conversations, if we never have difficult conversations with people who disagree with us, then we're never going to be able to move forward in our country. I feel like we've got to have that point where we can agree and we can disagree and without being disagreeable, and we can talk on reason more than passion, which is easier said than done.
Sure. I was thinking just like, kind of going back to like my original point of the question, it was originally saying that, we got to have some level of background knowledge to be able to like critically think and critically read, about these topics. But if we can't talk about them, then we're not going to be able to build that background knowledge well. So I think for me, I think that step has to come first in some ways before we can do the other things.
So we're maybe pretty far afield from what my report was about, but one of the things that I have come to believe over the last few years is one of the most important jobs that K-12 educators can be doing, and particularly social studies educators can be doing, is to respond to what some researchers have called truth decay, where we have the kind of the death of authority, where we used to have, people used to believe what was in the newspaper, and now, people were talking about truth decay before the term fake news even really became popular, but there's just, people get their news from Facebook, stuff like that, where there's not really an authority, or people have such a distrust of authority that it makes it very difficult for them to know how to weigh different types of evidence. And so there have been some places that I think have handled this much better. Some of the, for example, the Baltic states that have a constant threat of Russian invasion, they get bombarded with fake news all the time. They know it's a national security issue. It's not a partisan thing. And so they've done some really good things in their K-12 system to help students to do better media literacy and be able to sort out what's fake, what's real, and what's a clue that this is not a good source for me to base my opinions on. And I think that's very difficult because, as I was thinking about the challenge that the teachers you're talking about, Mr. Lusher, is it Lusher? Sorry. The challenges that you were talking about, I was just thinking like, there's so many different ways you can make it touch on American history or the American, government system, or, there's a lot of ways that you could kind of tie in that content or those, interesting topics, or to make those topics more relevant because of the events that we're seeing. But at the same time, if the people don't agree about what the events we're seeing are, then it's going to be a little harder to make that connection. And so it may be pretty important that we get some of that training where students are able to learn, how do I figure out what a valid piece of evidence is when they're hearing 1,000 different things and their parents are saying one thing and their friends are saying another thing, and they're hearing all this stuff about fake news and they don't know exactly how to sort that stuff out. And I think that's a challenge for adults. I wish we'd undertake that on a larger national scale, but you all have a captive audience. So, we're, I guess, hoping that some of that stuff, which can be done in a completely nonpartisan, non-polarizing way by raising bad examples from all sides, because it's easy to find bad examples from all sides if you're looking for them, even if we may, some of us may think that one side does it more. So anyway, that's just, I know that's pretty far afield from where we've been in terms of this report, but I do think that that's a really important topic that you all might think about. The Rand Corporation has this big report series called Truth Decay, I think, that is really fantastic, and it might be a good centerpiece for some PD at some point in the future.
All right, thank you.
All right, are there any other questions? Our time is just about up, but any last minute questions or comments?
I have a question. Are you all planning on following up with studies related to your questions that were on the next to the last slide about more integration of social studies into the English language arts block in elementary school?
We do not have a project, a specific project that we're working on. We're always interested in these topics. So we will continue to be thinking about it. You may see blogs. We have our own blog at fordhaminstitute.org. We'll continue to blog about it, to think about it. If you follow on Twitter, Education Gadfly, or you follow me on Twitter, we be tweeting about this stuff. Certainly engage in these conversations, and we'll continue to be and have events about this over the coming months and years. We don't have a specific project in mind. We have these kind of reports that we do, and we do them on all kinds of different topics. And this one, it was we did the best we could. I do have a paper or an article coming out in I think it's called Social Educator. It's one of the magazines that you all might be familiar with, that is for social studies educators, that builds on this a little bit and does address some of those, some kind of follow-on stuff that I've found. But so you might look out for that if you subscribe to that magazine. If you have other ideas, you can send them my way, and I'll take a look and see if we can find a way to get at it.
Well, I think it would be interesting to dig a little deeper into that question, specifically with the text that teachers in elementary schools are using. And then to go back to Mr. Lesher's question and what Peter said about the debate or speaking their opinions. All of those things in Oklahoma are elementary school standards that fall under English language arts in speaking and listening. So it just seems to me like that if there was some study done, then that would give us a foundation to get our teachers' feet on about beginning ELA instruction with text. And yes, it can be social studies text instead of relying so much on the textbooks that we are given. So thank you. I will look for your article.
Great. I would say it's not one or the other in terms of curriculum versus some other social studies text, because there are some ELA curricula, like we talk about in the report, Wit and Wisdom, and the Core Knowledge Language Arts curriculum. Those have been at least rated by others. I'm not an expert on these things at all, but they've been rated by others as being very rich in content and building knowledge sequentially and in a way that is not the kind of scattershot approach that we see in a lot of ELA instruction.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Tyner, for the session today. It's just awesome. So I appreciate you sharing with us today. And I want to remind everyone to follow the link in the chat to the attendance form so that we can get you a PD certificate. So thank you, everyone.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for joining, everyone. And if you ever have anything you want to reach out about, I'm very easy to find on the internet. Just Google me and you'll find my email right away. I'm at the Fordham Institute. So I would love to engage with you all in the future if you have something that you want to talk about. But thanks a lot for having me.
Thank you. Thanks for the invite, Peter.